The morning sun hadn't yet broken over the Afghan mountains when Captain Rachel Morgan received the urgent message. She was in the middle of her pre-flight check on the Black Hawk helicopter, running her hands along the rotor blades with the careful attention that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. Her headset crackled with static before the voice came through clear and direct. All available combat pilots to the briefing room. Immediate response required. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. Immediate response meant something had gone wrong. She secured her checklist and jogged across the dusty airfield, her flight suit already clinging to her back in the early morning heat. The base was just waking up, but there was an energy in the air that told her everyone could sense something big was happening. Inside the briefing room, she found herself surrounded by nearly 20 pilots. Most of them were men she'd flown with before, good pilots who knew these mountains like the back of their hands. They were all talking in low voices, speculating about what kind of mission would require this many birds in the air. Rachel stayed quiet, finding a spot near the back wall where she could see the front of the room clearly. The door burst open and Captain James Hendricks strode in. Rachel recognized him immediately. Everyone on the base knew about the SEAL Team commander. He was a legend, the kind of operator who had more successful missions than most people had hot meals. His face was weathered and serious, with eyes that seemed to look right through a person. Behind him came 3 other SEALs, all wearing the same expression of focused intensity. "Listen up," Hendricks said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. "We have a situation developing 70 miles northeast of this position. A reconnaissance team made contact with a high-value target approximately 4 hours ago. The target is moving through a valley system we've been monitoring for 6 months. This is our best chance to capture or eliminate him." He pulled up a map on the screen behind him. Rachel studied it carefully, noting the terrain features, the elevation changes, the narrow passages between cliff faces. It was brutal country, the kind of place where one wrong move could send a helicopter into a mountainside. "The problem," Hendricks continued, "is that our original insertion point has been compromised. Enemy forces have moved anti-aircraft weapons into the primary landing zone. We need to find an alternate route, and we need a pilot who can navigate through terrain that's going to push the limits of what these birds can do." Rachel felt her heart rate pick up. She knew those mountains. She'd flown over them dozens of times, studying the wind patterns, memorizing the peaks and valleys. There were routes through there that most pilots wouldn't attempt. Narrow channels where the rotor wash would bounce off cliff walls and threaten to flip an aircraft upside down. "The insertion needs to happen in the next 3 hours," Hendricks said. "After that, the target will be out of reach, probably for good. I need a pilot who can take my team in low and fast, drop us at a secondary location, and extract us when we're done. The flight profile is going to be dangerous." "I won't lie about that." The room was silent. Rachel could see some of the other pilots shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't a standard milk run. This was the kind of mission that could go sideways in a dozen different ways. The kind where pilots earned medals or ended up as names on a memorial wall. "I need someone who knows these mountains," Hendricks added. "Someone who's flown in conditions that would ground most aircraft. Someone who won't hesitate when things get complicated." Rachel's mind was already working through the problem. If the primary landing zone was compromised, there were only 2 other options she could think of. One was a narrow shelf on the north face of the valley, barely wide enough for a helicopter to hover. The other was a dried riverbed that would require flying below the ridgeline, using the terrain to mask their approach. Both were incredibly risky. She thought about staying quiet. She could let someone else volunteer, someone with more experience or more flight hours. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew she wouldn't do it. She'd joined the Army to fly helicopters in combat, to be there when it mattered most. This was exactly the kind of moment she'd trained for. Hendricks scanned the room, his eyes moving from face to face. "I know what I'm asking. If anyone here can do this, step forward now. We're running out of time." The silence stretched on. Rachel could hear someone coughing in the back, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of jets taking off from the runway. She saw several pilots glance at each other, but no one moved. They were all doing the same calculation she was, weighing the danger against the mission requirements. Then Rachel felt her legs moving. She didn't make a conscious decision to step forward. Her body just did it, driven by something deeper than rational thought. She moved away from the wall and took 3 steps toward the front of the room. Every eye in the briefing room turned to look at her. Hendricks studied her for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or assessment. Rachel met his gaze steadily, keeping her breathing even and her hands relaxed at her sides. "You've flown that sector before?" Hendricks asked. "Yes, sir," Rachel replied. "Multiple times. I know 3 possible approaches that could work, depending on current wind conditions and enemy positions." One of the other SEALs whispered something to Hendricks. The captain nodded slightly, then looked back at Rachel. "What's your name?"
"Captain Rachel Morgan, sir."
"Charlie Company, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers," Hendricks said, a note of approval in his voice. "How many combat hours?" 843, sir, including 220 in this specific area of operations." Hendricks exchanged glances with his team members. Rachel could see them having a silent conversation, the kind that only came from years of working together in life or death situations. Finally, Hendricks turned back to her. "All right, Captain Morgan. You've got the mission. Briefing in 20 minutes. I want to see your flight plan and your backup options. If I don't like what I see, we'll find someone else." Rachel nodded sharply. "Yes, sir." As the other pilots filed out of the room, Rachel caught some of their expressions. A few looked relieved. Others seemed skeptical, probably wondering if she really knew what she was getting into. One older pilot, a major with gray in his hair, gave her a small nod of respect as he passed. Rachel didn't have time to worry about what they thought. She had 20 minutes to plan a flight that could change the course of the war, or end her life. She headed straight for the operations center, her mind already racing through maps and calculations, wind speeds and rotor clearances. The mission clock was ticking and there was no room for error. Rachel spread the maps across the operations table, her fingers tracing the contour lines that showed the violent terrain of the Afghan highlands. She had exactly 18 minutes left before the briefing with Captain Hendricks. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, stood beside her, his face tight with concentration. "You're really doing this?" Marcus asked quietly. He'd been flying with Rachel for 8 months, and they'd developed the kind of trust that came from surviving difficult situations together. "Already committed," Rachel replied, not looking up from the maps. "Now help me figure out the best approach." She pulled out 3 different satellite images, each showing potential routes into the target area. The primary landing zone that Hendricks had mentioned was marked with a red X, anti-aircraft weapons. That meant they'd be flying into a shooting gallery if they tried the obvious approach. "Option 1, Rachel said, pointing to a narrow valley on the north side. "We come in from here following this ridgeline. Stay below 200 feet. Use the terrain to mask our approach. The problem is this bottleneck." She indicated a spot where the valley narrowed dramatically. We'd have maybe 10 feet of clearance on either side. In daylight with perfect conditions, it's possible. But if there's any crosswind— Marcus shook his head. "That's suicide. The rotor wash alone could slam us into the cliff face." "Agreed," Rachel said. "Option 2, we fly east, circle around through this area and come up through the dried riverbed. It's wider, gives us more room to maneuver, but it adds 15 minutes to the flight time and we'd be exposed to anyone watching from these ridge positions." "What's option 3? Marcus asked. Rachel hesitated. She'd flown this route exactly once 6 months ago, during a training exercise that had nearly ended in disaster. It was a path through a series of interconnected valleys, threading between peaks that rose over 12,000 feet. The route required precise timing, absolute concentration, and a little bit of luck. "We go straight through the middle," she said, tracing a line with her finger. "This valley system connects directly to the target area. It's shorter, faster, and it keeps us below the ridgeline the entire way. The terrain provides natural cover from any observation posts." Marcus studied the map carefully. "That's the route that almost killed you during training." "It almost killed me because I was still learning the wind patterns," Rachel corrected. "I know them now. I've studied this area every day since that flight. I know where the updrafts hit, where the air gets turbulent, where we need to adjust for altitude." "And if the conditions have changed? If there's a storm system we don't know about?" Rachel looked at him directly. "Then we abort and find another way. But Marcus, this is the best option. It gets the SEALs to their objective with the least exposure time and the highest probability of success." Before Marcus could respond, the door opened. Captain Hendricks entered, followed by his 3 team members. They all carried that same intensity Rachel had noticed in the briefing room. the focused energy of professionals preparing for combat. Let's see what you've got. Captain, Hendricks said, moving to the table. Rachel walked him through her analysis, explaining each option and why she'd eliminated the first two. When she got to the third route, she didn't sugarcoat the dangers. She showed him the elevation changes, the narrow passages, the spots where things could go wrong. This section here, she said, pointing to a particularly tight turn in the valley, requires a banking maneuver at high speed. We'll be tilted at about 30 degrees, with less than 50 feet between the rotor blades and the rock face. If there's unexpected turbulence, we could lose control. One of the SEALs, a sergeant with a scar across his chin, whistled low. That's some cowboy flying, ma'am. It's precision flying, Rachel corrected. Every move calculated, every adjustment planned in advance. Nothing cowboy about it. Hendricks studied the map for a long moment. Rachel could see him running scenarios in his head, weighing risks against rewards. Finally, he looked up at her. What's your confidence level on this route? Rachel didn't hesitate. 70% that we make it through without incident. 20% that we encounter difficulties but still complete the mission. 10% that we have to abort. No percentage for catastrophic failure? Hendricks asked, raising an eyebrow. If I thought there was a significant chance of that, sir, I wouldn't have volunteered. Something like a smile flickered across Hendricks' face. Fair enough. What do you need from my team? Weight distribution is critical, Rachel explained. I need to know exactly how much gear you're carrying, where everyone will be sitting and how that weight shifts during insertion and extraction. Every pound matters when we're threading through those valleys. The SEALs spent the next 10 minutes going through their equipment lists. Rachel made notes calculating center of gravity, fuel consumption, and performance margins. The numbers were tight, but they worked. Barely. One more thing, Hendricks said. The target is mobile. There's a chance our extraction point will change based on where the operation takes us.
Can you adapt on the fly?
Rachel pulled out another map, this one showing a wider area around the target zone. I've identified 4 potential extraction points. 2 are relatively easy to reach, 2 are challenging but doable. If you end up somewhere else, I'll need you to give me at least 10 minutes notice so I can plan an approach. You'll get it, Hendricks promised. They spent another 20 minutes going through details, communication protocols, emergency procedures, what to do if they took fire, what to do if the helicopter was damaged. Rachel had answers for everything, drawing on years of training and experience. Finally, Hendricks stepped back from the table. All right, Captain Morgan, you've got the mission. We launch in 2 hours. Use that time to prep your aircraft and your crew. My team will be ready. As the SEALs filed out, Marcus turned to Rachel. You realize we're about to attempt something that most pilots would refuse to do? I'm aware, Rachel said calmly. She was already mentally rehearsing the flight, visualizing every turn, every adjustment to collective and cyclic controls. And you're not scared? Rachel looked at him directly. Terrified. But fear doesn't get to make my decisions. The mission does. She gathered her maps and headed for the aircraft hangar. Her crew chief, Sergeant First Class David Chen, was already there, conducting pre-flight checks with meticulous care. Rachel had specifically requested Chen for this deployment. He was the best mechanic she'd ever worked with, someone who could diagnose problems by sound alone and fix them with whatever materials were available. Heard you volunteered for something crazy, Chen said without looking up from the engine he was inspecting. It's not crazy if it's calculated, Rachel replied. That's what crazy people always say. Chen shot back, but there was no judgment in his voice. Just the easy banter of professionals who trusted each other completely. Rachel climbed into the cockpit and began her own checks. She tested every control, every instrument, every backup system. She checked fuel levels, oil pressure, hydraulic fluid. She verified radio frequencies, studied weather reports, and reviewed the flight plan one more time. Marcus joined her in the cockpit, settling into the co-pilot seat. They ran through their checklist together, the familiar rhythm of preparation helping to calm Rachel's nerves. This was what she knew. This was what she was good at. An hour later, the SEALs arrived. They loaded their gear efficiently, each man knowing exactly where everything went. Rachel watched them work, impressed by their professionalism. These weren't just soldiers. They were artists at their craft just like she was at hers. Captain Hendricks climbed in last, taking the seat directly behind Rachel. Ready when you are, Captain. Rachel glanced at Marcus, who gave her a thumbs up. She looked back at Chen, who was securing the final equipment straps. He stepped clear of the aircraft and signaled all ready. Rachel's hands moved across the controls with practiced ease. She brought the engines up to speed, feeling the helicopter come alive beneath her. The rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, until they were spinning at full speed. "Tower, this is Night Stalker 27, Rachel said into her radio. "Request clearance for immediate departure." "Night Stalker 27, you are cleared for departure. Good hunting." Rachel pulled up on the collective and the Black Hawk lifted smoothly into the air. Below them, the base grew smaller. Ahead, the mountains waited, ancient and unforgiving. The Black Hawk cut through the morning air, heading northeast toward the mountains that dominated the horizon. Rachel kept the aircraft at a comfortable altitude for now, using these initial minutes to get a feel for how the helicopter was handling the weight and to let her crew settle into their positions. Through her headset, she could hear the steady breathing of the SEALs behind her. They were completely calm, probably running through their own mental preparations for what was coming. Marcus was monitoring the instruments, occasionally calling out readings that Rachel already knew, but that formed part of their standard communication protocol. "Approaching first checkpoint," Marcus announced. 23 minutes to valley entrance." Rachel nodded, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead. The ground below was mostly barren, dotted with occasional villages and the winding paths that passed for roads in this region. In the distance, she could see the mouth of the valley system she planned to use, a dark gap between two massive peaks. "Beginning descent," Rachel said. She eased the collective down smoothly, bringing the Black Hawk lower. The key to this mission was staying below radar coverage, using the terrain to hide their approach. That meant flying low, sometimes dangerously low, skimming over hills and dropping into valleys. The landscape began to change as they got closer to the mountains. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills, then to steeper slopes covered with rocks and sparse vegetation. Rachel adjusted her flight path constantly, reading the terrain like a book, anticipating where the wind would shift, where updrafts would try to push them off course. "Entering valley system in 3 minutes, Marcus said. His voice was steady, but Rachel could hear the tension underneath. They both knew what was coming. Rachel reduced speed slightly, giving herself more time to react to whatever they encountered. The mouth of the valley loomed ahead, a narrow opening between sheer cliff faces. From a distance, it looked impossible that a helicopter could fit through there. Up close, it looked even worse. "Here we go," Rachel said quietly. She took the Black Hawk into the valley entrance at precisely the angle she'd planned, tilting slightly to the right to account for the crosswind that always blew through this gap. The walls of the canyon rose up on either side, close enough that Rachel could see individual rocks and cracks in the stone. The helicopter shuddered as it hit the turbulence she'd expected. The wind in these valleys did strange things, bouncing off walls, creating invisible currents that could slam an aircraft sideways without warning. Rachel's hands moved constantly on the controls, making tiny adjustments, keeping the Black Hawk stable. 50 feet clearance left side, 60 feet right side, Marcus called out. His job now to watch their surroundings while Rachel focused on flying. The valley curved to the left. Rachel banked into the turn, her eyes tracking a point on the far wall that she'd memorized from the maps. Get the angle wrong here, and the rotor wash would push them into the cliff. Get it right, and they'd slip through cleanly. The helicopter tilted, the world rotating around them. For a few seconds, the cliff face was directly above them, close enough to touch. Then they were through the turn, and the valley opened up slightly. Behind her, Rachel heard one of the SEALs exhale slowly. "That's some fine flying, ma'am," he said. Rachel didn't respond. She was already focused on the next obstacle, a section where the valley split into 3 different channels. She needed the middle one, the narrowest of the 3, because it was the only route that led where they needed to go. 30 seconds to the split, Marcus warned. Rachel could see it now, the valley branching like fingers. She adjusted their approach, lining up on the center channel. This was another critical moment. If she entered at the wrong angle, they'd have to abort and circle back, wasting time and possibly alerting anyone watching the area. She threaded the needle perfectly, bringing the Black Hawk into the middle channel with less than 40 feet of clearance on either side. The walls were so close now that the rotor wash created a constant buffeting effect, the air bouncing back and forth between the stone faces. "Altitude dropping," Marcus said. We're at 180 feet above ground level. Rachel was ahead of him, already adjusting. The valley floor was rising as they went deeper into the mountains, which meant she needed to either go higher or accept even less clearance. She chose to go higher, but only slightly, keeping them below the ridgeline where they could still be seen from above. The flight became a continuous dance of adjustments, up 10 feet to clear a rock formation, left 5 feet to avoid a protruding cliff face, right 3 feet to compensate for a sudden gust of wind. Every movement had to be precise, calculated, smooth. Any jerky motion could destabilize the helicopter or slam them into the walls. "How much longer through this section?" Captain Hendricks asked from the back. His voice was calm, professional. 6 minutes to the widening, Rachel replied. Then it gets easier for a bit. Those 6 minutes felt like an hour. The valley grew even narrower, forcing Rachel to slow their speed to give herself more reaction time. Sweat was starting to run down her back despite the cool air at this altitude. Her hands were relaxed on the controls, but every muscle in her body was tensed, ready to react. A sudden downdraft hit them, pushing the Black Hawk toward the valley floor. Rachel countered immediately, pulling up on the collective, adding power. The helicopter shuddered but held steady. Marcus was calling out altitudes, keeping her informed without cluttering the radio with unnecessary chatter. "Passing the narrowest point," Marcus said. "Valley widening ahead." Rachel could see it, the walls gradually spreading apart as the valley opened into a broader basin. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They'd made it through the worst part of the approach. The wider section gave her room to maneuver, and she used it to check their position against the map. They were exactly on course, right on schedule. The target area was now just 12 minutes away. "So far so good," Marcus said quietly. Rachel didn't answer. She'd learned long ago not to tempt fate by celebrating too early. They still had to complete the insertion, wait for the SEALs to do their job, and then extract them. And if intelligence was wrong about the enemy positions, things could get very complicated very quickly. The valley began to narrow again, but this time the walls weren't as close. Rachel maintained their speed, following the twisting path between the mountains. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. In different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Right now, it was just a tactical environment, every feature analyzed for threat or opportunity. "Radio chatter," Marcus said suddenly. "Enemy frequencies. They're talking about seeing something." Rachel's grip tightened on the controls. "Can they see us?" Marcus listened intently to the intercept. "Negative. They're talking about seeing aircraft to the south, probably a patrol from the base. But they're getting nervous. Time to target?" Rachel asked. 8 minutes. Rachel increased their speed slightly. They needed to get the SEALs on the ground before the enemy got too alert. But she couldn't go so fast that she lost control in these tight spaces. It was a balance, like everything else about this mission. The valley took another sharp turn, this time to the right. Rachel banked into it, her eyes tracking the cliff face, watching for the landmark that would tell her they were approaching the insertion point. There it was, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a broken tooth against the sky. 3 minutes, she announced. Behind her, she could hear the SEALs preparing, the sound of weapons being checked, gear being adjusted, the quiet professionalism of men about to go into combat. Captain Hendricks moved forward slightly, looking over her shoulder at the terrain ahead. "The landing zone is just beyond this next ridge," Rachel said. "It's a narrow shelf about 60 feet wide. I'll need to hover while you fast rope down. I can hold position for 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes if we're lucky. We'll be fast," Hendricks promised. Rachel brought the Black Hawk around the final turn, and suddenly the landing zone was visible. It was exactly as the satellite images had shown, a shelf of relatively flat ground jutting out from the mountainside. Below it was a sheer drop of several hundred feet. Above it, the mountain continued upward. "There," Marcus said, pointing. Rachel saw them at the same moment. Movement in the valley below the landing zone. People, maybe vehicles, it was hard to tell from this distance. The enemy forces that intelligence had warned about. "Contact below," Rachel said calmly. "Multiple targets in the valley. They're between us and the landing zone." Hendricks leaned forward, studying the situation. "Can you get us in without being seen?" Rachel was already adjusting her approach, planning a route that would use the mountain itself as cover. "Yes, but we'll need to come in high and fast, then drop straight down onto that shelf. It'll be rough." "Do it," Hendricks said without hesitation. Rachel pulled the Black Hawk up, gaining altitude rapidly. The helicopter climbed above the ridgeline, exposed for a few seconds to anyone watching from below. Then she pushed the nose forward and dove, dropping like a stone toward the landing zone. The world seemed to tilt as they fell. Rachel's hands moved across the controls with absolute precision, controlling their descent, keeping them lined up with the tiny target below. The Black Hawk fell through the air like a controlled missile, dropping toward the narrow shelf that would serve as the insertion point. Rachel's eyes were locked on her target, her hands making constant micro-adjustments to keep them on the correct trajectory. The altimeter was unwinding rapidly, the numbers spinning down as they descended. At the last possible moment, Rachel pulled back hard on the cyclic and increased collective pitch. The helicopter's descent slowed dramatically, the sudden change in momentum pushing everyone against their restraints. The Black Hawk shuddered under the strain, but Rachel held it steady, bringing them to a hover just 3 feet above the rocky shelf. "Go, go, go!" Hendricks shouted. The seals were already moving. The side doors were open, ropes deployed. The team members slid down with practiced efficiency, hitting the ground and immediately spreading out to secure the perimeter. Hendricks was last, giving Rachel a quick thumbs up before disappearing down the rope. Rachel counted in her head. 15 seconds. 20. The helicopter was completely vulnerable here, hovering in place, an easy target for anyone who happened to look up. 25 seconds. 30. Last man on the ground, Marcus reported. Ropes clear. Rachel didn't waste time acknowledging. She pulled up on the collective and pushed forward on the cyclic simultaneously, bringing the Black Hawk up and away from the shelf in a climbing turn. Below, the seals were already disappearing into the rocks, moving toward their objective with the quiet efficiency that made them legends. Insertion complete. Rachel transmitted on the command frequency. Package delivered. Moving to holding pattern. The response came back immediately from the operations center. Copy Night Stalker 2-7, good work. Maintain radio watch for extraction call. Rachel flew away from the immediate area, finding a position on the far side of a nearby mountain where they could hover in relative safety. From here, they had clear radio contact with the SEAL team but were out of sight from the valley where enemy forces were moving. Now came the hard part. Waiting. Rachel reduced the engine power to a sustainable level, one that would keep them airborne but conserve fuel. They had enough for 3 hours of flight time, which should be more than adequate. But in combat, things never went exactly as planned. "How long do you think they'll need?" Marcus asked. Rachel shrugged. Hendricks said between 90 minutes and 3 hours, depending on what they find. Could be longer if things get complicated. She pulled out a water bottle and took a long drink. The adrenaline from the insertion flight was starting to fade, leaving her aware of just how tense she'd been. Her shoulders ached and her hands were cramping slightly from gripping the controls so hard. "That was some impressive flying back there," Marcus said. "The way you dropped us in without being seen, I've never experienced anything like that." "It's just physics and practice," Rachel replied, but she couldn't quite hide the small smile. It had been good flying, she knew that. The kind of maneuver that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. They settled into a routine, monitoring the radios, checking instruments, staying alert. Time crawled by. After 45 minutes, Rachel's legs were starting to cramp from holding the same position. She shifted slightly, working feeling back into her muscles. The radio suddenly crackled with activity. "Night Stalker 2-7, this is Falcon 6. Rachel recognized Hendricks' call sign immediately. "Falcon 6, go ahead. We have eyes on the target. Moving to intercept. Be ready for possible emergency extraction. Current position holding, but that could change." "Copy that," Rachel replied. "Standing by." Marcus met her eyes. They both knew what emergency extraction meant. Something had gone wrong, and they might need to get the SEALs out under fire. Rachel started running through scenarios in her mind, planning approach routes, identifying cover positions, calculating fuel margins for different options. More time passed. An hour, 90 minutes. Rachel's nerves were stretched thin now, the waiting almost worse than the flying. At least when she was at the controls actively navigating, she had something to focus on. This passive waiting was torture. Then the radio exploded with sound. Gunfire, shouting, someone calling for covering fire. Through it all, she heard Hendricks' voice, calm and controlled despite the chaos around him. "Night Stalker 2-7 Falcon 6. We need immediate extraction. Primary LZ is compromised. Moving to alternate position Delta, how copy? Rachel was already moving, bringing the engines up to full power. Solid copy, Falcon 6. Moving to alternate position Delta, ETA 7 minutes. Make it 5 if you can, Hendricks replied. We've got company and they're not happy. Rachel didn't bother responding. She was already pushing the Black Hawk to maximum speed, racing back toward the area where she'd dropped the team. Marcus was pulling up the maps, identifying alternate position Delta, calculating the approach. It's on the ridge above the original insertion point, Marcus said. More exposed, but easier to reach. Tell me about enemy positions, Rachel demanded. Marcus switched to the intelligence frequency, listening to the reports coming in from overhead surveillance drones. Multiple contacts in the valley. They're moving toward the SEAL position. Estimate 20 to 30 fighters, possibly more. Rachel's mind was racing through the tactical situation. The SEALs were outnumbered and needed extraction. The landing zone was exposed. There would almost certainly be enemy fighters with weapons capable of shooting down a helicopter. This was going to be dangerous. She brought the Black Hawk around the mountain, dropping low again to use terrain masking. The valley opened up ahead of her, and she could see smoke rising from several locations. Tracer rounds were visible even in the daylight, red streaks cutting through the air. I have visual on the landing zone, Rachel announced. I also have visual on approximately 15 enemy fighters moving up the ridge toward that position. Copy, Hendricks responded. We see them too. Can you discourage them? Rachel looked at Marcus, who was already moving to the door gun. Crew chief, ready the guns. We're going in hot. Sergeant Chen moved with practiced efficiency, chambering rounds and checking the weapon systems. Ready when you are, ma'am. Rachel altered her approach, bringing the Black Hawk in at an angle that would put them between the enemy fighters and the SEAL team. It was a dangerous position, exposing them to ground fire, but it would give Chen clear shots at the approaching enemy. 30 seconds, she called out. She could see the SEALs now, moving quickly across the rocky terrain toward the extraction point. They were carrying someone, one of their team members who appeared to be wounded. Behind them, muzzle flashes indicated they were still in contact with enemy forces. Rachel brought the Black Hawk into the fight like a weapon itself. The door gun opened up, Chen firing controlled bursts at the enemy positions. The heavy rounds tore into the rocks around the fighters, forcing them to take cover and disrupting their advance. 10 seconds to LZ, Rachel announced. She was flying on pure instinct now, her years of training taking over. The helicopter danced through the air, dodging, weaving, while maintaining a stable enough platform for Chen to keep firing. Below, the SEALs reached the landing zone. Rachel flared the Black Hawk, bringing them to a hover 6 feet off the ground, higher than she wanted, but the terrain was too uneven to get lower. The SEALs didn't hesitate. They lifted their wounded teammate up first, strong hands from inside the helicopter pulling him aboard. Then the others came, one after another, climbing and being pulled up with urgent speed. Something pinged off the helicopter's hull. Then again. Rachel realized they were taking fire from multiple directions. She kept the Black Hawk as steady as she could, knowing that any sudden movement could throw off the boarding SEALs. Last man boarding, Marcus shouted. Rachel saw Hendricks climbing up, providing covering fire even as he entered the aircraft. The moment he was aboard, Rachel didn't wait for confirmation. She pulled power and lifted, bringing the Black Hawk up and away from the landing zone. More rounds hit the helicopter, the distinctive metallic sounds telling Rachel they were taking damage. Warning lights flickered on the instrument panel. But the engines were still running, the rotors still turning. They were flying. Everyone aboard, Hendricks confirmed. Get us out of here. Rachel pushed the Black Hawk to maximum speed, racing away from the fight. Behind them, the enemy fire was diminishing as they put distance between themselves and the shooters. She climbed rapidly, gaining altitude, putting mountains between them and the threat. Damage report, she called out. Marcus was scanning the instruments. Multiple hits to the fuselage. Oil pressure is dropping on engine number 1. Hydraulics are showing stress but holding. We're still flyable, but I don't know for how long. Rachel made a quick decision. The base was 40 minutes away. With a damaged engine, they might not make it. But there was a forward operating base just 20 minutes to the south, a small outpost with a landing pad and medical facilities. New destination, she announced, plugging in the coordinates. We're heading to Firebase Phoenix. It's closer and we need to get that wounded man to medical care. The Black Hawk limped through the sky, every mile feeling like a victory. Rachel kept her eyes moving between the instruments and the terrain ahead, watching the oil pressure gauge with particular attention. The needle was hovering just above the danger zone, fluctuating slightly with each beat of her heart. Behind her, she could hear the SEALs working on their wounded teammate. Someone was calling out medical terminology, another voice responding with vital signs. The professional calm in their voices told Rachel the situation was serious but manageable. The man would live if they got him to proper medical care soon enough. Firebase Phoenix, this is Night Stalker 27, Rachel transmitted. We have a damaged aircraft and a priority casualty on board. Request immediate landing clearance and medical support. The response came back within seconds. Night Stalker 27, Firebase Phoenix. We copy your emergency. Landing pad is clear. Medical team is standing by. Be advised we have limited facilities here. Any medical care is better than what we can provide in flight, Rachel replied. ETA 12 minutes. Marcus was maintaining constant communication with their base, updating them on the situation. The operations center was already coordinating for a maintenance team to fly out to Firebase Phoenix with repair equipment. But first they had to make it there in one piece. The damaged engine chose that moment to start making a new sound, a grinding noise that made Rachel's stomach clench. The oil pressure dropped another notch. She immediately began the process of reducing power to that engine, preparing to shut it down if necessary. Engine 1 is going critical, she announced calmly. Preparing for single-engine flight. Marcus's hands moved across his panel, adjusting systems, balancing loads. They'd trained for this scenario dozens of times, but training and reality were different things. In training, you knew the ground was safe if something went wrong. Out here there were mountains and enemy fighters and a long way to fall. The engine noise grew worse. Rachel made the decision. Shutting down Engine 1. She went through the shutdown procedure methodically, every action deliberate and controlled. The engine wound down and suddenly they were flying on a single turbine. The Black Hawk's performance changed immediately. They were heavier now, less maneuverable, burning fuel faster to maintain altitude and speed. Firebase Phoenix in sight, Marcus announced. Rachel could see it too. A small cluster of buildings and fortifications on a flat stretch of ground. The landing pad was clearly marked and she could see figures moving around it, preparing for their arrival. Medical personnel with a stretcher, ground crew ready to chock the wheels and secure the aircraft. She adjusted her approach, compensating for the reduced power and the changed flight characteristics. The Black Hawk responded sluggishly, not like the nimble aircraft she'd been flying an hour ago. But it responded, and that was what mattered. Final approach, Rachel said. Everyone brace for landing. She brought the helicopter in carefully, fighting a crosswind that wanted to push them off course. The damaged aircraft didn't have the same reserve power to fight the wind. So Rachel had to use every bit of her skill to keep them aligned with the landing pad. The skids touched down harder than she would have liked, the Black Hawk settling onto the concrete with a thump that made the whole airframe shudder. But they were down. They were safe. Engines to idle, Rachel commanded. She and Marcus worked together to shut down the remaining engine, going through the post-flight checklist even as the medical team rushed forward to extract the wounded SEAL. Rachel finally allowed herself to relax slightly, slumping back in her seat. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat, her hands trembling slightly from the sustained tension of the past 3 hours. Marcus looked over at her and grinned. Nice flying, Rachel. Really nice, she managed a tired smile. Team effort. You kept us together when things got complicated. The SEALs were disembarking now, carrying their wounded teammate carefully down to the waiting stretcher. Rachel watched through the window as they loaded him up and rushed him toward the medical facility. Captain Hendricks paused at the door, looking back at her. He gave her a nod, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed respect, gratitude, and professional acknowledgement all at once. Then he was gone, following his team toward the medical building. Rachel climbed out of the cockpit on shaky legs. Sergeant Chen was already conducting a damage assessment, walking around the helicopter and cataloging every bullet hole, every damaged component. There were more hits than Rachel had realized scattered across the fuselage and tail assembly. We got lucky, Chen said, running his hand along a line of bullet holes that had missed critical components by inches. A few of these were way too close to fuel lines and hydraulics. Could have been much worse. How long to repair? Rachel asked. Chen shrugged. Depends on what parts they can get here. The engine is shot, needs complete replacement. We've got hydraulic leaks, damaged wiring, and what looks like a cracked transmission mount. Could be days. Could be a week, Rachel nodded. She'd expected as much. The Black Hawk had taken a beating, but had kept flying long enough to get everyone home. That was all she could ask of any aircraft. The base commander approached, a lieutenant colonel with tired eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd spent too many years in combat zones. Captain Morgan? I'm Colonel Davidson. Hell of a piece of flying you just pulled off. Thank you, sir, Rachel replied. How's the wounded SEAL? Doctors are working on him now. Gunshot wound to the leg, significant blood loss, but he's stable. They think he'll make a full recovery. Davidson looked at the damaged helicopter. I heard about your mission. Word is you threaded through terrain that most pilots wouldn't attempt. I had good reasons to take the risk, sir. Davidson smiled slightly. That's what they all say. Look, my people will take care of your aircraft and your crew. You've been flying for hours. Get some food, some rest. There's quarters available if you need them. Rachel nodded gratefully. Now that the adrenaline was fading, she was becoming aware of just how exhausted she was. Every muscle ached, and her head was pounding from the sustained concentration. She found the small mess hall and forced herself to eat, even though she wasn't particularly hungry. Her body needed fuel, and she'd learned long ago to eat when she had the chance, regardless of appetite. Marcus joined her along with Chen, and they sat in companionable silence for a while. Think they got him? Marcus finally asked. The target? Rachel shrugged. Guess we'll find out when Hendrick's team debriefs. But they wouldn't have called for emergency extraction unless something important happened. She finished her meal and headed for the temporary quarters, a small room with 2 bunks and basic amenities. It was luxury compared to some places she'd slept during her deployments. She lay down without even removing her boots and was asleep within minutes. When she woke, it was dark outside. Her watch told her she'd been asleep for 6 hours. She sat up, momentarily disoriented before remembering where she was. Firebase Phoenix, the damaged helicopter, the mission. She found a shower and cleaned up, then headed back toward the operations center. The base was quieter at night, just a few soldiers on watch and the distant sound of generators providing power. The sky overhead was brilliantly clear, stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds. In the operations center, she found Captain Hendricks reviewing paperwork with Colonel Davidson. Both men looked up when she entered. Captain Morgan, Hendricks said, standing. Good. I was hoping to catch you before we flew out. Wanted to thank you personally for what you did today. That extraction saved my entire team. Just doing my job, sir, Rachel replied. It was considerably more than that, Hendricks corrected. I've flown with a lot of pilots over the years. You're one of the best I've seen. The way you brought us in through those valleys, the precision of that combat extraction, the decision-making under pressure, all of it was exceptional. Rachel felt her cheeks warm slightly at the praise. Thank you, sir. Did you get your target? Hendrick's expression became unreadable, the way it did when discussing classified operations. Let's just say the mission was successful. Very successful. The intelligence we gathered will have significant impacts on future operations in this region. Davidson cleared his throat. Captain Morgan, I've already filed a report on today's mission with higher command. I'm recommending you for a Distinguished Flying Cross. Captain Hendricks is putting in for the same. Rachel blinked in surprise. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the highest awards for military aviation. Sir, I appreciate that, but I was just doing what needed to be done. That's exactly why you deserve it, Davidson replied. You saw what needed to be done, you calculated the risks, and you executed flawlessly. That's the definition of heroism in my book. Hendricks extended his hand. I need to get back to my base, but I meant what I said. If I ever need a pilot for another mission, you're my first call. Rachel shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. Anytime, Captain. Stay safe out there. After Hendricks left, Rachel spent some time reviewing the damage reports on her helicopter with Chen. The maintenance team from their home base had arrived and was already working on repairs. It would indeed be several days before the Black Hawk was flight ready again. What do we do in the meantime? Marcus asked. 3 days passed at Firebase Phoenix while maintenance crews worked around the clock to repair the damaged Black Hawk. Rachel kept herself busy with routine missions, but her mind kept drifting back to those intense moments threading through the mountain valleys, the precision required for every movement. the weight of knowing that lives depended on her skill. On the fourth morning, Sergeant Chen found her in the mess hall. "Good news, Captain. The bird is ready to fly. New engine installed, all systems checked and double-checked. We can head home whenever you're ready." Rachel felt a mixture of relief and something else she couldn't quite identify. Relief because being grounded had made her restless. The other feeling was harder to pin down. A kind of awareness that she'd crossed some threshold during that mission, proven something to herself that she hadn't known needed proving. "Let's do a full pre-flight inspection," Rachel said. "I want to personally check every system before we take her up." An hour later, she was walking around the Black Hawk with her checklist, examining every repair, testing every control surface. The new engine gleamed, still clean and unmarked by the dust and wear that characterized everything else in this environment. Chen had supervised the installation personally, and Rachel trusted his work completely, but she still needed to see it herself. Marcus joined her for the cockpit inspection, and they went through their standard procedures. Everything checked out perfectly. The helicopter was ready to fly. "Firebase Phoenix to Night Stalker 27, the radio crackled. "We have an urgent request. Medical evacuation needed at a village approximately 40 miles northeast of our position. Civilian casualties from an IED explosion. Can you respond?" Rachel looked at Marcus, who nodded immediately. They were supposed to be heading back to their home base, but a medical evacuation took priority over everything else. "Affirmative, Firebase Phoenix. Send us the coordinates. We're launching immediately." 5 minutes later, the Black Hawk was airborne. The helicopter handled beautifully. The new engine running smoothly. All the quirks and hesitations from the damaged systems now gone. It felt good to be flying again in an aircraft that responded the way it was supposed to. The village appeared on the horizon, a small collection of mud brick buildings clustered around a central square. Rachel could see smoke rising from one area. People gathered around what looked like the blast site. She brought the Black Hawk down in the only clear area available, a flat stretch just outside the village. Medical personnel from the fire base had flown with them, and they jumped out before the skids had fully settled. Rachel watched as they ran toward the casualties, professional and efficient even in the chaos. Children were crying, adults shouting, the whole scene painted with the confusion and trauma that followed any violent incident. The medical team worked quickly, stabilizing the most seriously injured and loading them onto stretchers. Rachel counted 4 casualties, including 2 children. Her jaw tightened. This was the reality of war in this region. The bombs and bullets didn't discriminate between soldiers and civilians. "We've got them," the lead medic called out. "Let's go." The flight back to Firebase Phoenix was tense and quiet. Behind her, Rachel could hear the medics working on the casualties, calling out vital signs, administering drugs, doing everything possible to keep people alive. She pushed the Black Hawk as fast as she dared, knowing that minutes could mean the difference between life and death. They landed at the fire base and the casualties were rushed to the medical facility. Rachel sat in the cockpit for a moment after shutdown, processing what she'd just seen. This was different from the combat mission with the SEALs. That had been dangerous, exciting even, in a way that only pilots understood. This was just sad, a reminder of why they were all here, trying to make some difference in an impossible situation. Marcus touched her shoulder. "You okay?" "Yeah," Rachel said, pulling herself together. "Yeah, I'm good. Let's get ready to head home." They refueled, filed their flight plan, and said their goodbyes to Colonel Davidson and the firebase personnel. Then they were airborne again, heading back toward their main base. The flight gave Rachel time to think, to process everything that had happened over the past week. She thought about the moment in the briefing room when Captain Hendricks had asked for a volunteer. How many times in a career did someone get a moment like that? A clear choice between playing it safe and stepping forward. And how many people actually stepped forward when the moment came? The base appeared ahead, larger and more developed than Firebase Phoenix, with multiple runways and dozens of aircraft. Rachel brought the Black Hawk in for landing, touching down smoothly on their designated pad. Home. At least the closest thing to home she had in this part of the world. The debriefing took 2 hours. Rachel walked her commanders through every aspect of the mission, from the initial flight planning to the emergency extraction under fire. They asked detailed questions about her decision-making, her risk assessment, her handling of the damaged aircraft. She answered everything honestly, including the moments where she'd been uncertain or afraid. "Outstanding work, Captain," the colonel said when they were finished. Your performance on this mission exemplifies the standards we expect from Night Stalker pilots. The recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross will move forward with my full support. After the debriefing, Rachel returned to her quarters. They felt small and cramped after days in the field, but they were hers. She dropped her gear and collapsed onto her bunk, staring at the ceiling. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Marcus entered, carrying 2 bottles of water. He tossed one to her and sat down in the room's only chair. "So we're famous now. Everyone on base is talking about the mission. Someone called you the Valley Ghost because of how you appeared and disappeared through those mountains." Rachel made a face. "I hate nicknames like that. Makes it sound more dramatic than it was." "It was dramatic," Marcus countered. "Most dramatic thing I've ever been part of, and I've flown in some hairy situations. But you know what stuck with me? It wasn't the fancy flying through the valleys. It was that moment in the briefing room when you stepped forward. Nobody else moved. Just you. Someone had to," Rachel said quietly. "But they didn't. You did. That's the difference." Marcus took a drink of water. "I've been thinking about that a lot. How many times in life do we have chances to step forward, and we don't take them because we're scared or unsure or just comfortable staying back? And then someone like you comes along and just steps up without overthinking it." Rachel considered his words. "I was scared. Still am, when I think about some of those moments. But being scared doesn't mean you don't act. It just means you act anyway." Over the next few weeks, Rachel returned to her normal duties. Flying missions, training exercises, the routine work that filled most military aviation. But something had changed. Other pilots started seeking her out, asking questions about technique, about decision-making under pressure, about how to stay calm when everything was going wrong. She found herself becoming a mentor, sharing the lessons she'd learned not just from the successful mission, but from all the flights that had come before, including the ones where she'd made mistakes. "The failures taught you more than the successes," she told them. "You learned your limits by testing them, sometimes by going slightly beyond them." 2 months after the mission, Rachel was called to a formal ceremony. The Distinguished Flying Cross was presented to her in front of the entire squadron, pinned to her uniform by a general who'd flown in specifically for the occasion. Rachel stood at attention, feeling the weight of the medal, the weight of what it represented. Captain Hendricks was there too, having received the same award for his actions during the operation. Afterward, they talked briefly. "I meant what I said," Hendricks told her. "Next time I need a pilot for something difficult, you're my first call." "I'll be ready," Rachel promised. That night, alone in her quarters, Rachel took out a journal she'd been keeping. She wrote about the mission, about the moment of decision in the briefing room, about what she'd learned, not for anyone else to read, but for herself, a way of processing and understanding her own experiences. She wrote, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something matters more than the fear. When Captain Hendricks asked for a pilot, I was terrified. The mission profile was dangerous, the margins for error tiny. But I also knew I was capable of flying it. And I knew that if I didn't step forward, someone else would try. Someone who might not have the same preparation or knowledge of that terrain. So I stepped forward, not because I was brave, but because I was ready. And being ready creates its own kind of obligation." Rachel closed the journal and looked at the medal on her desk, gleaming in the lamplight. It wasn't about the recognition, though that was meaningful. It was about the knowledge that when the moment came, when someone needed a pilot who could fly through impossible terrain and bring warriors into battle, she had been ready. She had stepped forward. And that, she realized, was what she'd been training for all along. Not just the technical skills of flying a helicopter, but the mental preparation to act when action was needed, to volunteer when others hesitated, to accept risk in service of something larger than herself. 6 months had passed since the mission that earned Rachel the Distinguished Flying Cross. The medal now sat in a small case in her quarters, alongside other ribbons and awards that marked her years of service. But the real change wasn't visible in decorations or rank. It was in how she approached every flight, every mission, every moment in the cockpit. The Afghan winter had arrived, bringing snow to the high peaks and bitter cold to the valleys. Flying became more challenging, with ice forming on rotor blades, reduced visibility, and unpredictable weather patterns. Rachel adapted, as she always did, learning the new conditions, studying how the helicopter responded to cold air and heavy loads. She was in the middle of a routine supply run when the call came through her headset. It was a voice she recognized immediately, even through the static and interference. Night Stalker 27, this is Falcon 6. We have a situation. Captain Hendricks. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Falcon 6, go ahead. We're pinned down in a valley approximately 60 miles north of your current position. Took casualties during an operation. Weather is closing in fast. We need immediate extraction. But every other available aircraft is either grounded or too far away to reach us in time. Rachel glanced at Marcus, who was already pulling up maps on his display. She looked at the weather radar. A massive storm system was moving through the region, and the valley Hendricks described was right in its path. What are the conditions at your location? Rachel asked, deteriorating rapidly. Snow, high winds, visibility less than a quarter mile, and we've got hostile forces approximately 2 clicks away, moving toward our position. Rachel, I know what I'm asking. This is beyond dangerous, but my men are hurt and we're running out of time. Rachel looked at the instruments, at the weather display, at the fuel gauge. They had just enough fuel to make it to Hendricks' position and back, assuming no delays, no complications, no unexpected detours. The weather would make flying nearly impossible. Any sensible pilot would say no, would tell Hendricks to wait for conditions to improve. But Rachel had learned something during that first mission with Hendricks. Sometimes the right choice wasn't the safe choice. Sometimes people's lives depended on someone being willing to push past what seemed possible. Falcon 6, we're coming to get you, Rachel said. Send me your exact coordinates. We'll be there in 25 minutes. There was a pause on the radio, and when Hendricks spoke again, his voice carried a note of relief. Copy that, Night Stalker 27. Coordinates are being transmitted now. And Rachel? Thank you. Rachel changed course immediately, turning the Black Hawk toward the north. The storm was visible on the horizon, a dark wall of clouds and snow moving across the mountains like a living thing. They were going to be flying straight into it. Are we really doing this? Marcus asked, though his hands were already adjusting systems preparing for difficult conditions. We're really doing this, Rachel confirmed. Run through the emergency procedures. Make sure everything is ready if we need to put down somewhere unexpected. They flew toward the storm, watching it grow larger with each passing minute. The first snowflakes began hitting the windscreen, light at first, then heavier. Visibility started to decline. Rachel reduced their speed, giving herself more time to react to obstacles she might not see until the last second. The radio crackled with updates from Hendricks. His team was still secure, but the hostile forces were getting closer. One of his men was badly wounded, bleeding internally, and needed surgical care within the next hour or he would die. The stakes couldn't be higher. Rachel entered the storm system like diving into a gray-white ocean. Suddenly, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Snow swirled around the helicopter, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The wind buffeted them from multiple angles, trying to push the Black Hawk off course. Switching to instruments only, Rachel announced, her eyes focused on the displays. She couldn't trust what she saw through the windscreen anymore. She had to trust the gauges, the altimeters, the navigation systems. She had to trust her training and her instincts. The helicopter shook violently as they hit a pocket of turbulence. Rachel fought to keep them level, her hands working the controls with practiced precision. Marcus called out altitudes and headings, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. 10 miles to target location, Marcus said. Wind speed increasing. We're being pushed east of our flight path, Rachel corrected, fighting the wind, maintaining their course through sheer determination and skill. The Black Hawk was being thrown around like a toy, but she kept it under control, kept it moving forward, kept it flying. Falcon 6, Night Stalker 27. We're 5 miles out. What's your situation? Hostile forces are within 1 click now. We're holding them off, but we can't maintain this position much longer. The LZ is marked with infrared strobes. You won't be able to see them in this snow, but they should show up on your night vision. Rachel switched to her night vision display. The world became green and grainy, but the storm seemed slightly less impenetrable through the enhanced optics. She pushed forward, descending carefully, following the navigation coordinates that would lead her to Hendricks' position. Then she saw them, small points of infrared light, pulsing in a pattern that marked the landing zone. They were in a narrow valley, surrounded by high walls with barely enough room for a helicopter to maneuver, and the wind was howling through that valley like a tornado, making the approach nearly impossible. I see the LZ, Rachel transmitted. Beginning approach. This is going to be rough. She brought the Black Hawk down slowly, fighting the wind every inch of the way. The helicopter wanted to drift, wanted to spin, wanted to do anything except go where she was telling it to go. Rachel compensated constantly, making micro-adjustments, feeling the aircraft through the controls as much as seeing it on the instruments. 50 feet above the ground. 40 feet. The wind was worse here, channeled by the valley walls into violent gusts that came from unpredictable directions. Rachel's arms were aching from the constant corrections, but she didn't let up, didn't ease her concentration for even a second. 20 feet. 10 feet. The ground appeared suddenly through the snow, closer than Rachel had expected. She pulled back slightly, arresting their descent, bringing them into a hover just 3 feet off the ground. "We're here," she shouted over the intercom. "Get them loaded now." Dark figures appeared in the snow, moving toward the helicopter. The SEALs carried their wounded teammate between them, struggling through the deep snow and high winds. Other team members provided security, weapons pointed outward, protecting the evacuation. Rachel held the hover, which was like trying to balance on a ball while someone kept hitting her from different directions. The wind pushed them left, she corrected right. A gust from behind tried to drive them forward into the valley wall. She compensated back. Every second was a battle against the elements. The wounded SEAL was loaded first, passed up into the helicopter by strong hands. Then the other team members came, moving as quickly as conditions allowed. Rachel could hear gunfire now, the distinctive crack of rifles cutting through the howl of the wind. The hostile forces had arrived. "Taking fire," someone shouted. "Load faster," Rachel commanded, though she knew they were already moving as fast as humanly possible. Marcus had taken up position at the door gun, returning fire toward the muzzle flashes visible in the snow. Tracer rounds streaked through the white chaos, drawing bright lines across Rachel's night vision display. "Last man boarding," came the call from the back. Rachel didn't wait for confirmation. She pulled power and lifted, climbing out of that valley as fast as the overloaded helicopter would allow. Rounds pinged off the fuselage, but she was already gaining altitude, already putting distance between them and the shooters. They climbed up through the storm, Rachel fighting for every foot of altitude. The helicopter was heavy now, loaded with the SEAL team and their gear, and it struggled in the thin mountain air and violent winds. But it climbed steadily if not quickly, breaking through the worst of the turbulence. "Everyone accounted for?" Rachel asked. "All present," Hendricks confirmed. "Medical team is working on Sergeant Rodriguez. He's critical but stable." Rachel set course for the nearest base with a trauma center, pushing the Black Hawk to maximum speed. The storm was still around them, still trying to knock them from the sky, but they were above the worst of it now. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to unclench her jaw, to realize that her hands were shaking slightly on the controls. "That was incredible flying," Marcus said quietly. "I don't know how you held that hover in those winds." Rachel didn't answer. She was focused on getting them home, on maintaining control, on delivering these warriors safely to medical care. There would be time later to process what had just happened, to think about the risks taken, the margins exceeded, the limits pushed. They landed at the trauma center 40 minutes later. Sergeant Rodriguez was rushed into surgery. The doctor said later that another 30 minutes and he would have died. Rachel's decision to fly into that storm, Hendricks told her afterward, had saved his life. Standing in the operations center later that night, warming her hands around a cup of coffee, Rachel reflected on how far she'd come since that first mission. She'd stepped forward in a briefing room 6 months ago. "You